really. It'll be fine. Yeah. All right. I think I got everybody on the roll, but we'll check again at the end and let's look at some stuff. Okay, thing number one. One of you, I'm not even going to name names, but I could because I bet you're not paying attention. I don't know. We'll see. Are you paying attention? Um, was that cynical of me to bet you weren't paying attention? I saw the president and his wife go interview some kids, and they said their favorite thing about remote learning is that they got to eat or take naps. Yeah. Okay. So now I know. I mean, we all know. Um, Somebody's asking book review due date. I could have sworn that we were just incredibly clear that the book review was due yesterday, but apparently on some old document somewhere, it said that you could turn it in Friday. Now, my guess is most of you who decided you were going to do the book review, even those of you who read the book on Saturday, turned in the book review already, which is ideal. Okay. The one or two of you who's like, it's not fair. You said Friday. I've said Monday like 15 times. But if you really think turning it in on Friday is a good plan, you go right ahead and I will look at it and I will grade it. Okay. And if some of the rest of you like, well, that's not fair. One, I'm going to tell you my mother's favorite saying since we're Mother's Day week, the ones that I can say, because she liked to swear quite a bit. I not so much, like never for me for some reason. But the ones that I can repeat to you, one of her favorite sayings was, life is not fair. She said that all the time. Um, but if you think you taking your book review back and revising it and turning it in again on Friday would help you, go for it. But my guess is you're glad it's done. Now, if you, again, if you want to look at it again, revise, turn it in by Friday, that's cool. I don't care. I'm not trying to be unfair to anybody in life, even though, as my mother said, life is not fair. So there you go. That's all I got. All right. Let's look at some documents. We'll try to have some Mother's Day themed discussions. Yeah. Okay. Here's the revised calendar. And this is the one that I used to put the due dates in the assignment section, I think. So revised calendar. This Friday is the chapter 13 question, or excuse me, chapter 27 question about Bush, which you might still be working on, which is absolutely positively fine. And I'll probably do like a grading marathon this weekend. I have grading due for my other job this week. So honestly, I'm probably going to ignore anything you've turned in for a couple more days. Sorry. And then next week is the chapter 28 question and the quiz. Your quiz review is already up, but of course the quiz won't be up until next Wednesday. So this Friday is the chapter 27 question, and next Friday is the chapter 28 question plus the quiz. Okay. All right. Somebody's chatting. Let's see it. Can I give a page for chapter? I don't have any idea what you're talking about. So are you asking me what page you can find the answer on? It's college. If you're asking me that, I'm sure what I told you last week was that this really is pretty much anything from World War II on. So I probably didn't give you a page. I'm pretty sure I didn't. So if I'm you, and I'm not, because I'm really old and stuff, but if I'm you, what I would do is think about times where we went overseas, and we're going to talk about the weekly question in a minute, but I would think about times where we went overseas and just use that nice index in the book and look up that event, like look up Vietnam conflict, and you'll find pages in the book, and it'll tell you where to go. I'm telling you guys, I don't know if you didn't have these discussions when you were in elementary school, but you know, school is way different when I was a kid, when we had slates and no electricity and whatever. But we have these units all the time about parts of a book, you know, you'd have the the introduction and the dedication, and you'd have the copyright page, and then you'd have well, what is it, where they tell you where all the chapters are? I forget what it's called. But then at the end, you might have the end notes, and you would have the index. I am telling you, the index of a textbook can really be your best friend. So index at the back of the book, just look stuff up and it gives you page numbers. You don't even, and I will tell you this as well. If you go to, when you're not in high school, and I know some of you are not, but you have the benefit of having high school kids in your class. When you are not in high school, if you ask your professor what page to look on, they probably will just give you an F and not even look at your stuff again. Don't ask your professor stuff like that when you're not, in a dual credit class. In a dual credit class, it's like, yeah, they're 14 or 15, so they're going to ask stuff like that. When you're, out of high school, we just look at you and go like, don't be lazy. And that was not directed at whoever asked the question. That was just my general, when you're outside of ACC, not in a dual credit. Yeah, because even if you were in my not dual credit class, I would probably go, don't ask that. But anyway, all right. Book review. Book review that you're resubmitting. Oh, somebody's coming in here. 2 textbook quotes comparison is good. I don't care. 2, if they're good, is fine. Yeah, I mean, it's really about quality more than quantity in section 3, because I know you've spent, a lot of section 2 quoting from your book. So a couple from the textbook, I think, is fine. It's kind of going to depend on your subject as well, because some of you will have subjects that they talk about a lot in the textbook, and others of you will have had some subjects where they just mentioned the era, if that makes sense. I don't know that that's a good answer for you, but that's what you're getting because it's the true answer. So hopefully that helped a little. But yeah, it's really more about quality. Yeah, thanks. Not trying to be jerky with you. Maybe I am. I don't know. I'm not. I just don't. I'm sorry. All right. What were we looking at next? Weekly question. Let's look at 1302 weekly questions. There we go. All right. Yeah, I didn't have page numbers for you because, I can't do it. So we'll talk about both the 27 and 28 weekly question, depending on where you're at. So let's talk about 27 first, number 13. George W. Bush commented in the inaugural address that America had gone out into the world to protect, not possess, defend, not to conquer. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Give examples to support your position. Okay. I know I've talked to you about weekly questions every week. So I know I say some of the same things over and over again, but I'm going to say a couple of the same things over and over again. 1, your answer has to be longer than the question. 2, your answer has to have specific examples like names, dates, people, names, those are names, places, descriptions of stuff. So, So on this one, how I would go about this is I would mention that George W. Bush says this as he begins his first term. And so in saying that, he's not referencing anything that he does during his presidency because he hasn't done anything yet. So for you, as a person answering the question, I would not spend most of my question talking about Bush's foreign policy, because when he says this, he has no foreign policy. Now, it is a suggestion, it's a hint that he's not going to be uncomfortable sending the military places, because he's already said that he thinks when we do stuff like that, that we're protecting and defending, okay? But here's how I would go about this. I would likely find some pre-Bush examples of when we sent troops places. And I wouldn't go too far back. Like, I'm not going, American Revolution or Civil War. I'm going 20th century at least, okay? And probably I'm not going back before World War II. Although if you want, you can mention World War I. I don't care. But I would talk about World War II maybe, or Vietnam, maybe Korea. I know that's out of order. So Vietnam, Korea, let me try again. World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the 82 million times we send troops to the Middle East, or you can talk about times in the 30s and beyond where we send troops to Latin America or the Caribbean, however you like that. But I would probably try to pick a couple of times where it looks like maybe we're protecting and defending, and maybe a couple times where, or at least one of the, where we're possessing and conquering. So pick at least one example that is the opposite of what you believe, and then pick a few more examples of the thing you do believe. So if you think we're mostly protecting and defending, pick a couple of times where it looks like we did that. If you think we're mostly possessing and conquering, pick a couple times where you think we did that, and pick maybe one of the opposite that could be argued that we were protecting and defending, or whichever. So that'll help me know that you realize that Bush wasn't necessarily crazy, even though you disagree with him. You are also welcome to mention some stuff that happens during Bush's presidency. That's completely fine. Absolutely. However, if you don't mention anything that happened before his presidency, it's going to bother me because I'm going to think you didn't notice that he says this before he does anything, even though I've told you half a dozen times. And it does irritate me, only a little, that when I tell you stuff half a dozen times, or if I say, like, in your answer, I expect to see this, and I don't see it, what it tells me is that when I'm telling you what to do in your answer, you're not paying any attention. And then you'll send me an email later and you'll say, well, somehow I missed this, so could you send me the page numbers where I should look? And then it's like, dang, kid, pay some attention. Or at least go back to the video where the screen is up, where it has the weekly questions. That's always my hint to you as well. If for some reason, like that's when you were eating lunch or took a nap, like the kid told President Biden, if that's where you took your nap, you got a video. So go back to the video where the screen shows the weekly questions, and then you'll know I'm talking about the weekly questions. Okay, all right. So Bush mentioned that he makes the comment, the event that he makes the comment. I would talk about some stuff that happens before he's president, some stuff that shows protect and defend, some stuff that shows possess and conquer. So this is not going to be one of those questions where all the answers are on page, 852 to 856. This is one of those where you've got to think about all the stuff you've learned and pick a couple of examples. So it's a little more analytical. It's good though. We like that kind of stuff in college. Yes, it's our favorite thing. All right, and then the last question, which should be fun, maybe, because you've lived through this, at least some of this. You've lived through this. You just may not have been paying attention to Obama, because some of you were, little kids. So compare Barack Obama and Donald Trump's presidential campaigns. Notice how I've highlighted this, presidential campaigns. Do you know why I've highlighted this? Yes, you do. Because people will answer this question and they talk about their presidencies. It's not what I'm asking you. Talk about their campaigns, what they did when they ran for office, differences and similarities. And we'll talk about this later. Sorry about you not being in the US. However, this one, you can look this one up in the index as well. So for presidential campaigns, you'll want to notice the use of technology and what makes them maybe typical or atypical presidential candidates. And yeah, use of technology and stuff that kind of where they fit the norm or they don't fit the norm. Yeah, but we'll talk more specifically about this as we go through those chapters. But I think that, yeah. Yeah, no, yes, I promise you on these weekly questions, these all come, I mean, they're directly designed to be answered by you reading the textbook. So you can always find the answers in the textbook, always. It's part of why I ask you to buy the textbook, not so you could spend $40 and never open the thing, but it gives you the details that maybe back up some of the general assertions that I make in class. You know, part of your job in college is reading textbooks. I know you don't do it in high school, believe me, I know, because you know, I taught high school forever. So, but read the book. I'm just saying, won't cause you any harm. No harm will come to you from reading the book. All right, let's look at the notes for a little while. Yeah, okay. Sorry, that allergy thing is a little rough. I feel like we're done with that chapter, aren't we? There's a little button that says go back to where you left off. All right. I feel like we were kind of in this area, so we may just review a minute or two of this stuff. 28. Yeah, I was thinking that. Thank you. I appreciate it. Oh, excuse me. Sorry. Dang. Okay. So lots of immigrants. I think it's always kind of important to remind ourselves of that. Although, you know, one of you said I wasn't even in the U.S. when this happened. You're one of the folks. So good job. Thanks for coming. Say thanks to your parents. Probably not your decision, but we're glad you're here. All right. So I think what you see with immigration, historically, U.S., is there certain times in our history where we get a whole bunch of immigrants. Usually has to do with international turmoil. I think people come to the United States because of our love of freedom. Maybe that is it. But I also think sometimes they come because, you know, you can make cash here. Yeah, you can. This is still a pretty nice economy, and we have a good balance of nice economy plus some political freedom, that sort of thing. And it's a relatively pleasant place to live. I know it's not perfect, by the way. Um, so I think we still draw lots of immigrants. Now, the reason that you've got a whole bunch of folks from a whole bunch of different places is we changed a bunch of laws in the 60s. This may have been something that you discussed in Did We Become More or Less Free in the 60s. We changed some immigration laws during that time period. So it's going to get rid of some of the quotas that we'd had before. And the preference for European immigrants, not that we dislike Europeans, but you're going to see a bunch more immigrants from places that are not Europe. Yeah. And we're also the Reagan administration. And I know there were a couple of you that talked about, and again, I get it with Reagan. I lived through that era, and people either hated Reagan or thought he was the greatest president ever. So it's like he's either the devil or he's perfect. And it's sort of like, I don't know, it feels a little like modern political times, even though during his presidency and Clinton's as well, and Bush's, Democrats and Republicans did work together pretty well in Congress. But anyway, Reagan passed immigration, pushed for and signed an immigration bill that legalized lots of folks who had come over without the benefit of legal immigration and helped them have a path to citizenship. And it was a large number of folks. And it was fairly controversial in the Republican Party because, you know, Republican Party, modern Republican Party is sometimes seen as really conservative and maybe not immigrant friendly. Now, I know that that's an overstatement. Believe me, I know that. I look at election results and statistics and things like that. But it's an overstatement, perhaps, that generally works. So it's why we have those sometimes. But all the new immigrants who came in during this time period, or a lot of the new immigrants, came from places that we had previously denied immigration. So this will be a pretty big change in or lead to a pretty big change in demographics and culture, which has led to a pretty big adjustment to people born in the United States, getting used to cultural shifts, that sort of thing. And that also is probably kind of an understatement, isn't it? So, and lots of folks who come in who are not from a Judeo-Christian background, and that is part of the reason. I know you noticed the rise of the what do they call religious right, or it was Moral Majority was the official name of the group in the 80s and 90s. But part of the reason that you see a little bit of a pushback, I don't know if pushback is the right word, but we'll go with it. More political activity from conservative Christians is they feel like their heritage is going to be erased or something along those lines. You saw something similar, although probably, excuse me, maybe a little more virulent in the 1920s, with the Scopes monkey trial, but also really strong anti-immigrant stuff that you saw through Sacco and Vanzetti and lots of other, things along those lines. But that was sort of the big example. And I do completely realize I watch the news pretty much every day that we see some similar things like that. I don't know if you've seen, gosh, there's some crazy video from, I think it's Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, where some guy stops this woman because she's using her cell phone while she's driving I think it was in a school zone. And then when she stops him, she keeps calling him a murderer. It's the weirdest thing. And then tells him that he just wishes he could be white, but he never will be. And it is the most, it's not the most bizarre thing. It fits in with other things that we've seen lately, but it's like, that's like a weird combination of all the things that everyone complains about, racist behavior. And then more conservative people go like, yeah, but cops or police officers get treated really badly. And like, that's the combo of all of it. You just look at that as like, my goodness, we have collectively lost our mind. But I don't know that any of that I don't know what that has to do with. I don't think it has to do with immigrant. I have no idea. That's just weird. But anyway, okay. So we have lots of cultural change for sure. And we're still in the process of adapting to the cultural change, which is why I think we see lots of political upheaval. Now, the good news is historically, we eventually get it right. The bad news is it's the eventually part. We tend to take a while to do it. So, yeah. Okay. All right. So we're still working on that, aren't we? Not in class, but in the country. Three strikes laws, I know we've talked about that, and you're in a political period where we see a pushback against that, really by both parties. One of the things that happened in the Trump era, which probably seems weird, was a pushback against this, and lots of pardons and changes in laws and things like that you saw from the Trump administration to become more, I don't know that more lenient is the right word, but to change the types of punishments and try to make things more fair, and certainly get rid of any remaining three strikes laws. But you saw this push for this stuff during the Reagan, Bush, Clinton administration, really codified during the Clinton administration, but you saw the war on drugs really pushed during the Reagan and then sort of in the Bush administration. And then the laws passed during the Clinton. Yeah, but all three of those eras, in many ways, especially as far as law enforcement and punishment, that kind of stuff, were very conservative. And then the pushback really, I know I'm not talking like defund the police or, any of that stuff, which is, I know it's a bad slogan. But anyway, it's really a push against what people really have come to believe and conclude from this era were some pretty unfair laws. Okay. All right. And then the rights revolution. And I know I've mentioned this before, and I'll probably keep mentioning it because sometimes people fear the Supreme Court, which was fairly conservative during this era, fairly conservative. They're the ones who said the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional. So the reason gay marriage is the thing that it becomes legal really is the Supreme Court. It's not your legislators. It's not either, any of your presidents, because when President Obama ran for president in round one, he was in favor of the Defense of Marriage Act and opposed gay marriage. Also, I want to mention to you, I've just finished, teaching my 1301 class. And one of the things I like to remind them of is that President Lincoln, who I think is one of the greatest presidents in our history, and who's going to argue that, when he was younger, did not necessarily think that ending slavery, well, no, that's not right. He thought that colonization was the best way to end slavery. So to free the slaves, but send them to some random country in Africa. And that is certainly not anywhere close to how he felt as president, because he evolved and he changed. And yeah, because, when we learn stuff and we meet different folks and we see different situations, sometimes we change. And I'm not saying like you should change your core principles, but I do think sometimes we're wrong. So when we figure out that we're wrong about something, we should change. I'm not arguing, oh my goodness, I'm not arguing anything political at all here about gay marriage or not gay marriage. Although my assumption is you're young and you're just like, yeah, whoever wants to get married should get married, which honestly is kind of where I'm at politically. Because but anyway, I'm not sure the state should be in charge of who gets to get married and who doesn't. And plus, in your generation, you guys don't get married anyway. So I don't even know if it matters. But the point is, the Supreme Court in the modern era, it's really sort of served as a check and balance against laws that get passed that probably, in addition to being unconstitutional, sometimes feel unfair to certain groups. And usually that unfair and unconstitutional thing, they usually go together in the modern era. I do realize the court doesn't always make decisions we like, but in the modern era, like mid 20th century to the present, I think we see the court really as a check on probably popular ideas that are done more for political purposes than legal purposes. That makes sense. All right. And Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas, dang, that was a weird thing. I know I talked about that last time. It really was a weird thing because, here you have two, as far as how they live their lives, two fairly conservative folks. Well, neither of them, Clarence Thomas is extremely conservative politically. Anita Hill is not like crazy left wing or anything. She's a fairly moderate to liberal type person politically. They both lived fairly quiet lives. Neither of them were in the spotlight. You never heard of either of them. And Thomas gets nominated to the Supreme Court, and Anita Hill makes an accusation of sexual abuse, which it's one of those situations where there's no, there's not going to be a picture of it. There's not proof, that sort of thing. And it leads to a very narrow confirmation from Clarence Thomas. I didn't mention this either, but should have. There was a fellow, it's not on the quiz, I'm not saying it that way, but there was a fellow named Robert Bork who was nominated during this era. I think it was before Thomas. I know it was before Thomas. And he was he probably would have been the most conservative guy in the modern era on the Supreme Court. But because he was extraordinarily conservative, the Democrats in the Senate really pushed hard against the nomination, to the point where the president, and I think it was Reagan, goodness, I hate it when I can't remember. I think it was Reagan, and I'm looking on my phone, withdrew the nomination. So let me look that up really quick and get a date on that. And that was the first time that a nominee had been rejected because of his nominee to the Supreme Court had been rejected because he was too conservative or too liberal, because of his political stances. Before that era, honestly, before the 70s and 80s, really the 80s, when a president said, hey, this is 87, so it was definitely Reagan. When a president said, hey, I want this guy to be on the Supreme Court, as long as he wasn't a criminal, the Senate approved him. Like when we talked about Earl Warren, who is the guy that came in and in the middle of Brown versus Board of Education. He had not been on the Supreme Court. He'd not been on a circuit court. Now, he did have a law degree, but what he had done most recently politically was help the president get elected. He ran his campaign in California, and winning California really is quite helpful in a presidential campaign. So his qualifications, there's no way we would confirm him now. But during that time period, because the president wanted you and you weren't a criminal, that was enough. Yeah. So when you see people get rejected, which didn't happen very often, it was usually because there was something just slightly sketchy in their background. Yeah. They probably weren't really criminals, but they're, they had done something a little sneaky. Yeah. Thomas gets in and then has proven to be an incredibly conservative jurist. That's an understatement. He's easily the most conservative guy on the court, and was pretty close even when Antonin Scalia was there. You're going like, we don't care about any of this. Sorry, I get super excited about the Supreme Court. I'm just weird about it. Okay, let's talk about Bush. The Bush presidency. And this will take us through Bush and Obama, and then you even did a little bit of Trump. I mean, what a great chapter. Boy, we have lived through some odd stuff in recent years, or in your lifetime politically. Bush, I remember when Bush ran for president, and I thought, what the heck that really is what I thought. Now, he had been governor in Texas, and I thought he was an interesting governor and not a bad governor. I know we're not here to listen to my opinions, but he was pretty mainstream. Of course, I liked him because he was pro-teacher. Any Republican that's pro-teacher is like, okay, I'm all right with that. But he followed Ann Richards, who was incredibly popular, and it was sort of I will say I was surprised that he won, but he won, and governed kind of from the middle. But he also had a lieutenant governor who was a Democrat, and who, I don't know if you pay much attention to Texas politics, but in our system, the lieutenant governor is the guy with the most power, and the governor's kind of the cheerleader. So, Bush was the cheerleader, and what was his name? Crud. I can even see his face, but I can't think of his name. I'm going to look it up. Dang it. But the lieutenant governor, who'd been lieutenant governor for a really long time, was the most powerful guy. And then Bush and the lieutenant governor, who was a Democrat, worked really well together and became really close friends, that sort of thing. So, somebody's coming in. Bob Bullock, that's who it was. All right, let me check off the person coming in. So, and Bob Bullock's so powerful and was so important politically, they named the Texas History Museum after him. So that's why I should have known his name, right? But so Bush was like kind of middle of the road Republican kind of guy, and certainly very pleasant personality, not a very good public speaker. But that also kind of endeared people to him a little bit. So it's like, yeah, I'm not good at that either. So they thought Bush was pretty cool. He ran against Al Gore, and Al Gore was Clinton's vice president. So he was fairly well known. Super close election, so close that it was less than half a percentage point that in the popular vote. And it went down to several recounts in Florida, which ended up going to the Supreme Court. And now I'm sorry, I saw something in the chat about if you're late, do you need a note? It's college, no notes, you're good. So this ends up going to the Supreme Court. People are not excited about it because it was so close. And then weird stuff went on in the Florida election because they still had the punch card ballots, and they were trying to decide they didn't punch it all the way through, or if they punched two, how do we know who they meant? And there were certain counties where they voted for, what was that? There was some really, really weird anti-immigration guy. I don't know the being anti, I'm sorry, I know I didn't phrase any of that stuff, but an extremely kind of right-wing guy who that won a couple of counties in Florida, and people thought that had to have been a mistake because he didn't win anything anywhere. There's all kinds of weird stuff going on in the recount, and certain counties finished early, certain counties took a long time, and both sides ended up filing suit about it. So it eventually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court just said, look, we're done recounting. That's it. Bush is in. So people said he was selected, not elected, and people weren't very excited about it. And he comes in and does the big tax cut. And the economy was a little sluggish. And Republicans do tax cuts because that's what they think will stimulate the economy. And you know how statistics work. You can always find statistics to prove your point. So if you tend to like that idea, you'll find some statistics that prove your point. If you dislike it, you'll find some statistics that disprove that point or prove your point. And tax cuts are going to stimulate certain parts of the economy, and they could lead to inflation, or they could lead to an unequal growth of wealth, which that happens from time to time. But also, people will argue, the biggest expansion of the U.S. economy in the middle, which happens in the 50s and 60s, followed some tax cuts, and that is true as well. But that there are all kinds of factors that lead to economic growth. If you don't know that, you'll have an economics class where they'll talk about that. But it's true. But anyway, so Bush really, he was probably solidifying Republican support, especially the Republicans who thought, he might be too liberal. And he was not solidifying any support from the Democrats, and then 9/11. So after 9/11, there's no more Bush was selected, not elected. And because Bush is going to talk about national unity, and we're going to feel a lot of national unity, sort of, kind of, mostly. If you're wondering, 9/11, I know some of you were kids, some of you weren't born. Let me see, 4 attacks on United States, I don't know the land, we'll go with landmarks. 2 planes were flown into the World Trade Center. One was headed to the White House, and that's the one that got, the passengers took over and crashed it. So it ended up crashing in a Pennsylvania field, and then one into the Pentagon. So it was a coordinated terrorist attack from folks who were in the country but had overstayed visas. Almost all of them, I think there were 19, and 18 were from Saudi Arabia, directly, certainly indirectly, potentially from other places. And then after the analysis from the Defense Department, they decided that the people most likely to have sponsored the terrorist activities were from Afghanistan and Iraq, and that the mastermind behind, or the guy funding most of this, was probably Osama bin Laden. So then we are going to do some unusual things historically, like declare war on terrorism, not a country, but terrorism. Now, when we invade a country or retaliate against a country, I don't know how you're going to look at it. And you're welcome to look at it either way, because it's America and the United States. You can look at stuff however you like. When we send troops into a country, we will pick a country. We will. And Saudi Arabia is going to be pretty helpful in staging some of these invasions or retaliations. And it's going to lead to lots of conflict in the Middle East, which I know that there's fairly constant conflict in the Middle East, as there is throughout most of the world. I understand that as well. But it does lead to some fairly unusual ideas in foreign policy. So we'll discuss those. The first one really is this idea of the Bush Doctrine. And you'll definitely want to know what the Bush Doctrine is, because it is so unusual. The Bush Doctrine legitimizes preemptive war. And the idea of preemptive war is that before someone declares war on you, they're going to, so you want to prevent that attack. So preemptive war is like, I know you're going to do this, so I'm going to send troops to prevent this from happening. Now, the hint that something bad was going to happen was 9/11. So the Bush doctrine, you will use 9/11 as the justification for the stance on preemptive war, and that having a preemptive strike is a legitimate part of national security. So that's essentially the Bush doctrine. And we're also going to pass something called the Patriot Act, which has been renewed consistently since 2001. So the Patriot Act, I'm going to say out loud, I didn't remember for a long time that actually stood for something, the USA Patriot Act. So, it's always really clever if you can make an acronym. So the legislators who wrote this made an acronym, and this is the people who really didn't like the Patriot Act tended to be either on the far left, who just, really extreme First Amendment kind of folks, or libertarians. And those are, I wouldn't say they're extreme right-wing kind of folks. Those are just small government people. They want the government involved in as few things as possible. If they have to pick between a Republican and a Democrat, they're more likely to pick a Republican. In earlier eras, I have no idea what they do now, because both parties seem to like larger government and spending, that kind of thing. But it was uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. So this is going to lead to, there's a creation of the Homeland Security Division, and that's going to be all those folks that hang out at the airport, and Transportation Safety Authority expansion, that sort of thing. Because, you guys probably haven't flown before 2001, and I didn't much either, because when you're from the middle of the country, you don't fly. I don't know why we're scared of flying, but we just don't. Honestly, it's because we don't have very many big cities and we don't have very many airports. But and our population's small. But before that, like, your whole family could go into the airport with you. You'd all go hang out in the terminal. You might go get something to eat. You'd sit in the place where you go catch the plane, and you'd all wave and you'd look at the planes and stuff. It was like a big, family outing or something like that. But now, of course, you get your ID checked a bunch of times, and your whole family can't go beyond, like, they really can't do anything besides let you out and, and help you get your luggage, and you'd better do that fast. And I remember right after 2001, there were folks with machine guns in the terminals because, they were just nervous there were going to be a whole bunch more attacks and terrorism, that sort of stuff. And we had occasional small things that they caught. There's shoe bombings and lots of, a few odd things. But we definitely have a lot more airport security now than we used to. And we were probably a little light on airport security before 9/11, and that's no longer true. But the creation of a Homeland Security Agency is supposed to make the homeland a little safer, which is going to be a huge problem and embarrassment when we have Hurricane Katrina. And we're all ready for terrorism, but we are clearly not ready to respond to a big hurricane. But anyway, the Patriot Act, it doesn't say here really what it does. My assumption is because you're, your age, you probably have an idea what they do. They spy on you. They wiretap, and they look at all your electronic communication, and they don't have to have a warrant to do that necessarily. And they can also go to certain foreign security courts, FISA courts, and get secret warrants. Now, if you're wondering, does this happen a lot? I would go with no, it probably doesn't happen a lot, but they apparently download all sorts of data and store it in case they want to go back and search through it. So it can happen retroactively. The thing that was kind of big right after 2011 was that they would go to libraries and look at what books you checked out. They could search your library checkout records, that sort of thing. And of course, in the old days, most people didn't have personal computers. We surely didn't have cell phones that operate like a computer. So going to the library would be probably where you use something like a computer anyway. So they're essentially looking at your electronic communication in addition to what you checked out at the library. In the modern era, they can go through your cell phone data. And there's been, kind of interesting situations where, especially with Apple, they will try to decode or, I guess, remove the security systems on your cell phones. And, in situations where they've gone to the corporation to ask for assistance, the corporation has told them no. So there's been, in the modern era, some pushback against this. And it's also led to, really interesting discussions of when you're at school, does the school have the right to look through your cell phone? And because according to the Patriot Act, which has been revised since then, but still allows for a lot of search. According to the Patriot Act, especially right after 9/11, they could pretty much search anything at any time for any reason. So and it felt, like we were overlooking at best the Fourth Amendment, but people argued that because this was national security, that it didn't matter, that your security and your safety were more important than your privacy. And then, there's always that discussion of, if you don't have anything to hide, why does it matter? And I know what some of you are thinking right now, like, that's a dumb argument, but it is certainly the argument people made during that time period. But in 2005, when we had Hurricane Katrina, and the city of New Orleans in particular was not well prepared for this, and neither was the state, and neither was the federal government. People wondered, what exactly is the purpose of Homeland Security if we're concerned about terrorism, which was, 9/11 was terrible. There's no doubt about it. Hurricane Katrina, also terrible. And we knew Hurricane Katrina was coming, and we didn't get people out of New Orleans in time. And, lots of people died, lost, all their property, but it's the dying part that, of course, that was most tragic. And then there were lots of people who were evacuated to the Superdome, and then there's no electricity and no water. And we had our own tiny version of that a month or so ago. And, if you add that to a flood and a bunch of sick people, and dang, it was a really bad situation. And I remember it really well too, because teaching high school in the area, and we closed school because people started to leave New Orleans and they were evacuated to South Texas, Central Texas. So we had lots of people from New Orleans staying in our high schools because, schools are big and they have lots of showers and lots of cafeterias and things like that. So we had lots of people hanging out at our high school for a while, a couple days, week, I think it was. Interesting situation, but really tragic too for the city of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, and the federal government, and a lack of working together. And it was an instance where federalism was not helpful at all, because the city blamed the state blamed the federal, and the truth is none of those governmental entities served the people well. It was really sad. It was. All right, so after 9/11, there's a recession. And apparently part of the goal in bombing the World Trade Center was to harm the economy of the United States. Now, if you're wondering, was 9/11 the reason we had the recession? I'm going to go with no. It wasn't helpful, but it certainly was not the reason we had the recession. We had the housing crisis and bubble, which were a big part of the problem, and a banking crisis in 2008, which we really had not that we don't adequately deal with either. And we'll end up bailing out a lot of banks, but the people that they loaned the money to aren't going to get bailed out. So you'll have a whole bunch of people whose personal financial fortunes are crushed. So housing bubble, let's talk about that for a minute. You ready? Housing bubble? Because I know you all are probably currently looking for houses. No, of course not. You're not probably in that age group, but you may have parents who you live with that talk about this kind of stuff. or you just pay attention. So like right now, I have a niece who's a realtor, and I'll ask her like, how's everything going? And she just shakes her head, because right now we have weird stuff going on in the housing market in this area where everybody wants to buy a house, but there aren't that many for sale. So because of that, prices are going up really high. So you've got an inflationary market and a short supply. Now, there's a little of that going on after 9/11, but there's some stuff added to it. There are not very many regulations on certain types of mortgages. So they could do a mortgage where, like, the first 2 years, your payments were really low, and then you had something called a balloon payment, and then that got you up to what your payment should have been the entire time. And those mortgages, the mortgage is the loan for the house, because most people don't pay cash for their houses. Probably aware of that. Most people get a mortgage, which is a big loan for, the cost of your house, but there's interest added to it because, all loans do that. But because of the length of the loan, by the time you've paid off the house, you've paid probably twice the price of the house. Or if it's a 30-year mortgage, you've probably paid 3 times the price of the house. But the average person, can't buy a house with cash. So it's really the only way to get a house. And even with the mortgage and the interest and all that kind of stuff, typically your house payment is not dramatically more than an apartment payment. So you go like, at least I'll own the house. So it's kind of I got a family, middle class, I want to live in the suburbs kind of thing. So people buy houses. And it was really a thing during this time period. So the banks offered these weird balloon interest loans where they knew that the people they were loaning the money to could not make the house payment if they gave them just your standard mortgage. So they let them have usually about 4 or 5 years with a much, much lower payment. And the thought is always, well, I don't make that much money now, but in 5 years, I'm going to make a ridiculous amount of money. So this will be no problem. And that was really the basis of the loan, not can I currently afford this, but will I be able to afford it in 5 years? And the banks did this knowing pretty well that the chances were at least 50-50 that the people they loaned the money to would not be able to afford the house after that initial period. And that is truly what happened. So people, stayed in their houses for a few years. And then when that balloon payment and the new interest came, they couldn't afford the house and their houses got foreclosed on. Well, the banks could resell the houses if there were still buyers, which there were and there weren't sometimes. But the people who bought the house lost everything that they'd invested in the house, plus they had to go find a new place to live. And it was really hard on those folks. The larger banks who did these kinds of loans appealed to the federal government and asked to get bailed out. They asked to get whatever their debt was forgiven. And the truth is, with their assets, they probably could have afforded to take the loss. But what the politicians said is that they were too big to fail, too big to fail. So they got government bailouts. The smaller banks and savings and loans didn't get the government bailouts, so they collapsed. And they ended up having to repay their investors because, your investments or your deposits in banks are secured by federal interest, or federal insurance, FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, part of the New Deal, you remember. So what ends up happening is a big economic problem that takes us probably 10 years to climb out of. Economic collapse that certain families never recover from. And if your families were here during this time period, this, is like 10 years after the dot-com collapse. So it was really bad on the economy in the Austin area in particular. I remember my husband and I bought a house around this time period, but my husband's family were migrant farmers when he was a little kid. So he understood that there isn't always going to be more money. That's life. We did not operate under the illusion that in 5 years we were going to be wealthy. And I grew up in the Ozarks in Joplin, Missouri, and it's really one of the poorest places in the country. So neither one of us, when we bought a house, went, we got to have the best house. We'll be able to afford it someday. It's like, we got to have something we can afford now, and that in the future, the payment isn't going to go up. And yeah, we have to have a reasonable house. I live in a lovely, reasonable house. Not, that's probably not how people advertise, their houses when they're trying to sell them. This house is reasonable and you can actually afford it. But I remember when we applied for a loan, so I was a teacher and it was a long time ago. So we made, I think base pay was $20,000 a year. That's why people go into teaching, for the money. And I made slightly more, but it wasn't much more. And my husband worked at an auto body parts and supply store. So he sold auto paint and Bondo and stuff like that. And he was the store manager, assistant manager. I don't remember what he was at the time. So we made about the same amount of money. So we probably made $45,000 a year. So we went to apply for our house loan, and it's during this era where their standards are stupid. And they said, well, we'll give you a loan for $300,000. Now, $300,000 in that era would have bought essentially a mansion. I mean, it would have been a ridiculous house. And we just looked at each other like, that's dumb. That's just dumb. We make $45,000 a year, and they want us to have a house payment that's half of our salaries. Once you adjust it for taxes and insurance and all that stuff. And it's just dumb. But people didn't look at it and go like, that's dumb. They went, oh, that's great. I can afford that house because the bank said I can afford that house. The bank's goal is to give you a loan during that time period. They don't care if you can pay it back or not, because they can just resell the house. They're not really concerned about you. So my husband and I kind of understood that. We did not take the $300,000 house in the early 2000s. That would have been a bad call on our part. But a lot of people did, and we had friends who did, who made less money than we did. And it's like, how in the world? And they lost their houses. They did. And that's what happened in large measure during this time period. So it causes a massive economic collapse, which is really just about 8 or 10 years past that dot-com collapse. And it's a rough time period. And the 9/11 thing didn't really cause a lot of economic harm, but Hurricane Katrina caused a lot of economic harm as well as social harm. So it's a rough time economically, and you start to see maybe the beginnings of some correction in early 2009 after Obama wins election, but before he takes office. So you start to see a little bit of change, but it's really slow. And it's that recovery that will be referred to a lot as a jobless recovery. And part of that too, because all of this is going on in the midst of a massive corporate change, an international corporate change, where manufacturing jobs have all but disappeared from the United States in most ways. So, we're not building nearly as many cars, we're not producing nearly as much steel, and you guys are subject to the modern economy as well, where if you're not constantly learning new skills and constantly getting, unofficial education, then you're not going to be up to speed for the next phase of your job, which is going to change because of technology. And if you don't stay up with technology, then if you have a career, you're not going to be nearly as viable. So you go into the factory every day and making the same thing over and over and over again is probably not going to give you a really nice house in the suburbs where your spouse can stay home and your kids can go to college and you don't go into any debt. The economy changes dramatically for dozens of reasons. And government regulation of like housing loans and stuff like that isn't keeping pace. So this is kind of our version of the Great Depression. It's not nearly as serious, but it does change how the middle class lives. And it's also where you start to see a shift where the middle class starts to decline. So people in the middle class, some of them kind of bump up, but most of them bump down to where they're in the not middle class. And I don't know if we want to go with that as working class or lower class, or I don't know what we want to call that, but it's that part that's not exactly poor, but they live paycheck to paycheck, that sort of thing. And that honestly is where most people in our country are. So if you think, well, that's where my family is, it's like, yeah, that's where most people are, living paycheck to paycheck. And it's an exciting place to be. Yeah, but not exciting in a good way. And a lot of it has to do with some of the economic changes that happen, in part because of the dot-com collapse, the banking crisis of this era, but also that shift in manufacturing. And I'm going to say this, not really this opinion, which you don't have to agree with, of course, ever. Our educational system hasn't adapted very well to the changes in the economy. So, and I'm not ever going to argue, for obvious reasons, that it means we shouldn't study English and history and stuff like that. Your English matters all the time, because no matter what your job is, English will probably be the primary language you use to communicate in. And if you're going to have any sort of job where you make a decent amount of money, you're going to be writing to communicate. So if you don't write well and you don't speak well, people often make assumptions about you that may not be fair. So English always matters. History matters because, everybody has to write. History matters because without it, you do dumb things if you're ever in charge of stuff, or you don't understand how people get along and why they get along and that sort of stuff. So social studies, history, kind of those soft skills that make you more observant, more understanding of either politics or social situations, that kind of stuff. So all that stuff still matters. I'm just saying you guys need more job-related technical education. I'm certain of it. Yeah, I'm certain of it. Everything you do in high school matters. I'm not suggesting there's any waste of time stuff that goes on, because physical education is important because you got to be healthy. And arts and science always matter. I mean, arts because it makes you more well-rounded, and it's part of that social, emotional part of your learning that's important. And science and math, you guys are already convinced that's the most important thing. But what we've done to you educationally is convince you that your grade matters more than your learning. Because it's really the skill that matters. Not do I get enough points, but can I figure out what to do with what I might have learned? Also, I will say with technology, you guys are super skilled at cheating. And cheating is very rarely a skill that matters. There are probably a couple of jobs where that works, but you don't need an A. Yeah, I'm not your parents, so maybe you do need an A. All right, back to this. So economic collapse is really a problem. Now, we will talk much more about this as we kind of specifically start to talk about the weekly question next time. But the Obama election, clearly there's some historic stuff going on. We got the obvious thing, he's Black. I remember we were talking about the STAR test one time in class, and I typically taught AP US history. And I don't know if you guys have been in AP classes. I know you haven't taught any. They're terrible to teach. And here's why, because you guys in those classes are punks sometimes. I'm sorry, I'm just saying it. And I know that it's being recorded. Most of the kids are nice, but dang, some of those kids in there are punks. And they think that they're always smarter than their teachers, which is really punky and annoying. And I would always have kids that tell me, like, I know more about history than you do. And it's like, well, I hope not, because, I get paid for this. And if you do, I guess we should just pay you. But I had this one kid who, when he became valedictorian, gave a speech about how you should work less and cheat more. Like, he was cool. And he wanted to be a doctor. It's like, yeah, I hope you never get any patients, because you cheating through medical school ain't going to make anybody healthy. But he always told me pretty much, in front of the class how stupid I was. And I go like, you're so smart to notice that at such an early age, because what am I going to say to him? So we're going over STAR test stuff, and they had a question on the STAR test that year that asked what was unique about President Obama. The answer was that he was the first Black president. I mean, was not the hardest question on the test. And so I said, oh, wow, President Obama's Black. And then that guy said, see, I knew she was stupid. So it's like, way to go, punk. But President Obama is Black. I don't know if you noticed, but that's not really the only thing that's kind of unique about him. He's really kind of the first into modern technology president. He's going to raise money and campaign using technology in a way that nobody really had before. So social media, electronic communication, reaches new voters, grabs some traditionally Republican voters, that sort of thing. So it's kind of a reversal of the Reagan coalition. And he's going to win the states that Democrats typically win. And he's going to win some states kind of in the middle that often went to Republicans as well. All right, I'm going to look at the chat now, although I don't think I should, but I'm going to. Yeah, no, high school kids. Yeah, all right. All right. You're still talking about your A there. No, kids are, when you're 17, sometimes you do know everything. That guy's probably perfectly fine and embarrassed now. I hope so. I really do. But anyway, oh my goodness. Those kids are not much fun. I know they're in process, but they're not much fun to teach. My goodness. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So Obama's election historic, and his campaign's historic because of the things we mentioned. So when you do that part of the weekly question about his presidency or his presidential campaign, you'll definitely want to mention use of social media, electronic communication, and of course, he's Black. Yeah, I mean, you should mention that. So that's cool. And how he attracts new voters, younger voters, the excitement that he builds. And we really haven't had anything like that with the excitement of younger voters really since the Kennedy campaign. And he had some Kennedy, I think he was kind of our modern version of Kennedy because he's young. He's got the cute kids. He's got the very attractive and cultured wife. So I think, I think that he's kind of a modern version of Kennedy without, all the family tragedy and stuff. Yeah, and no, it is true. I know that I probably shouldn't make fun of a teenager as much as I just did. It's what you said is true. We can always learn something from anyone, and even those of you that think like Serna is really out of her mind and not a great professor, which I know you think that sometimes, but there are things that you can learn from me as well, even if I don't teach in a way that fits your learning style, that sort of thing. And we all have to look at what is valuable in what someone else does. I understand that, and yeah, that teen. I'm sure I wished he would have done that more for me, and I tried most of the time to do that with him. So hopefully all is well with him. I honestly, I would never wish anything bad for anyone. All right. So Obama. We'll do like the really brief Obama talk, and we'll come back and talk about the general things and then much more Obama chat, specific Obama chat next time. I always assumed that if you're a young person that grew up when Obama was elected, that you liked him, because why not? I mean, I never really understood people that like strongly disliked Obama. And honestly, I didn't understand people who strongly disliked Bush. I sort of saw them as pretty similar politically, even though I know one's a Republican and one's a Democrat, but they're both kind of in that moderate range of Republicans and Democrats, and they're both personalities are fairly similar. Their backgrounds definitely are not, but they both had the nice wife, the nice kids, a good family, all that kind of stuff, and seemed fairly reasonable, fairly temperate, that sort of thing. But anyway, okay, back to Obama. So we know all the stuff that we just mentioned in general about why his election and campaign were historic. Accomplishments that we'll want to look at and remember are Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, in 2010, and that's kind of changed a little over the years, but it requires everybody to have health insurance. And typically older people like this, younger people who are sick like this, younger people who are healthy do not. because younger people who are healthy generally just said, I'm just going to risk it, and didn't buy insurance. And part of the reason you don't buy health insurance is it's expensive. And people who could afford it, a lot of times didn't buy it because it's like, it's expensive when you were young. Now, people who can't afford it, the reason they call it Affordable Care Act is it's based on your salary or your income. So the less money you make, the less the policy costs. So it's going to end up being probably more expensive for younger people who make a decent amount of money. However, a lot of those younger people who make a decent amount of money have, they're younger, so they tend to be a little more generous politically. So their thought is healthcare is a right. It's not really a privilege that should just happen for people who have money. So I don't mind paying a little for this, even though it's not good for me economically. And of course, there's always the thing, you don't think you're sick, but then you are, because no one ever thinks they're sick, do they? All right, so it has some things that people dislike, but I think overall people like it. Plus, I was really shocked that because I grew up in a different generation where my parents said, you're 18, get out and pay for all your stuff. That really doesn't happen much in the modern era, which honestly is probably good because 18 is a weird time to be financially independent. Trust me on this. It's not my favorite thing in life, but clearly I survived, right? Yeah, my parents are like, see, it made you tough. It did not make me tough. But this allowed parents to keep their kids on their insurance until they were 26, which to me is like, wow, that's really weird. But almost everybody I know who's a parent, feels good about this. And my guess is your parents probably are okay with it as well. So Obamacare has, and the one thing that almost everybody thinks is fine is that it doesn't allow an insurance company to reject you because of pre-existing conditions. I'm not even going to look. It's 3-minute warning, right? Good job. Thank you. Okay. And the pre-existing condition thing, I will say this as somebody who had an incredibly sick husband. My husband was type 1 diabetic. And that doesn't always affect people poorly because I know, statistically, there's probably at least one of you in the group. So I'm not trying to depress you in any way. But he was just that guy that every bad thing that could happen to you medically, he took pretty good care of himself. He would, exercise every day. He refereed soccer on the weekends. I mean, he was relatively fit. But every consequence he could have, he just had, and started having, pretty serious problems even in his late 20s. And when he worked at that not so great job with the auto body place, he could not get insurance. It was tricky. When I got the teaching job, of course, I slid him on my insurance. But if you weren't married to somebody that could get you on insurance, if you were in his situation, even in his 20s, he could not be without insurance. And it was tricky. And everything that happened to him was expensive as well. So I don't know. But the reason he was always rejected on the smaller insurance plans that his private employers would have would be pre-existing conditions, and anything related to those, their insurance company, if they would allow him to have insurance, wouldn't cover for a certain number of months. And of course, anytime he was sick, it was related to being diabetic. So just wasn't a thing for him. So Obamacare, I get it. I know why people wanted it, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, that sort of thing. And I think it's why, you occasionally hear Republicans say, we've got to get rid of that. You're never going to get rid of the Affordable Care Act because people thought it was necessary. They may change it in some ways, might make it better, might make it worse, but they're never going to get rid of it because there really were gaps where people couldn't get medical coverage. So that's my sad story of the day, isn't it? You didn't come here for a sad story. You normally get sad history stories, right? Okay, it's almost time to go. I'm going to check the roll. I'm going to stop the recording.